Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to start with the deliciously dubious realm of street food from ancient Rome. Roman junk food, from greasy thermopolia counters to honey-soaked fig pastries consumed under the shadow of marble columns, was more than just sustenance. It was a mysterious sausage that combined flavor, prestige, and survival. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the globe, so please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Your tunic is clinging to you in all the wrong places. You're wearing your old sandals and slogging through a sun-drenched Roman street. And you're suffering from the kind of headache that only comes from drinking 5 glasses of watered-down wine and making poor choices at the bathhouse. You're not in the mood for a fancy dinner, and you're not going to argue with your neighbor over olive kinds or spit roast a pig. The thing you need is something quick, oily, maybe regrettable, that doesn't ask too many questions, and that doesn't mind if you eat it with one hand while shooing pigeons away with the other. Here comes Rome's deliciously chaotic version of a street food restaurant, the Thermopolium. Imagine Taco Bell from the past, but with more marble counters and a little looser food laws. The design is surprisingly straightforward, with enormous earthenware pots filled with whatever was hot, delicious, and survived the morning, and stone counters with circular holes drilled into them, each holding a dolia. There are no menus, labels, or any clear sense of order. Just a roiling stew of gastronomic and literal possibilities. What's available? A mystery stew that may contain lentils, or may only seem like it does, fried cheese balls that squeak when you bite into them, dubious sausage links that may be pig or optimism, and floating in everything like a ghost you can taste. In some ways, the Roman fermented fish sauce known as garum served as a social experiment and a seasoning. Is it clean? Let's not inquire. The dish is hot, salty, and has enough calories to keep you alive in a crowd for another afternoon, even though the cook is dressed in the same tunic he slept in, and the spoon he's using has witnessed at least 2 civil wars. There were thermopolia in almost every block, particularly in Pompeii. These counters were frequented by workers, students, itinerant poets, and bewildered Gaulish tourists who exchanged sesterces for quick, full, and dubious legal food. Even if it could cause you to feel nauseous, you follow your instincts and hope that they will forgive you later when you have to choose between a cold onion or whatever is bubbling at the corner stall. Your toga has a lentils stain on it, and your dignity is a little damaged when you left the Thermopolium. Now that you're in the forum, you hear that unsettling sound coming from your stomach once more. You need something to chew on while feigning to listen to a public speak event about wheat subsidies, not a meal. Let's introduce roasted chickpeas, or Caesar arietinum as they were known in the streets of ancient Rome. The name may sound sophisticated, but it literally means rocks masquerading as food. In a magnificent symphony of salesmanship, vendors shouted over one another as they sold them in clay bowls or tiny canvas pouches. Chickpeas that might or might not chip your molars, hot chickpeas, and crispy chickpeas. A consistency halfway between crisp and gravel was achieved by roasting them over open coals. Since salt was the Roman solution to everything, they were generously salted, preserving, flavoring, and masking the regretful taste. Despite this, chickpeas were very popular. On the march, soldiers ate them. Between bribes, senators nibbled on them. Kids gnawed on them as if they were preparing for adulthood. They were perfect for throwing into a lunchbox, bag, or at someone's head during a gladiator fight because they were inexpensive, filling, and didn't spoil readily. There wasn't much diversity. Not even hummus dip or chili lime taste, only a bowl of hard-to-digest beans, seasoned with salt and sometimes served warm, somehow a luxury. The Romans swore they were healthy, of course. It was claimed that chickpeas encouraged profound thinking, digestion, and virility. It sounds suspiciously like something that was made up by a chickpea vendor. However, why not if it aided in product movement? You would occasionally receive a soft one. It's a bit mealy and chewy, and for a split second you might think it's okay. Remember that Roman dentistry was still a millennium away from finding a solution to this issue when you bite the next one. Nevertheless, you got a food that was portable, long-lasting, and provided you with something to do with your mouth while listening to lengthy political speeches for a few pennies. And that was worth every broken tooth in Rome. Your stomach is requesting something different right now. Perhaps soft, perhaps sweet, perhaps less existentially gritty. You see a merchant holding a tray of sun-glinting golden spheres. Sweet things are frequently deceiving in Rome, so you approach with caution. Globuli, he adds, winking as he hands you one. What are they? Imagine honey-covered deep-fried cheese balls. Furthermore, this is not an invention of the Renaissance. Made by combining flour and ricotta-style cheese, rolling them into balls, deep-frying them in oil, and then bathing them in honey as if they had committed a crime against moderation, globuli were a true Roman dessert snack. They were delicious, sweet, and structurally precarious. Hot cheese would shoot in the other direction if you bit into one too quickly. Your fingers would be held together by the honey, guaranteeing that the remainder of your day would be spent with bees, dogs, or embarrassing hand signals directed at senators who were passing by. But don't be misled, globuli were popular. They were regarded as a dessert fit for dinner parties, temple festivals, and impressing anyone you were attempting to entice with sugar. The recipe may be found in Apicius, the Roman equivalent of a cookbook. The feel? Consider the outdoors. Crispy. Within? Lava made of melted cheese. Flavor? Dessert and what if cheesecake was aggressive are in the middle. These were essentially candied cannonballs, and the Romans had no idea that honey should be used with moderation. Additionally, they appeared at more formal events, even though they weren't truly street food for the general public. Frying cheese in oil needed some resources. Imagine the conclusion of a toga party, with everyone grumbling contentedly, their tunics smeared with cheese grease, and bees hovering like little waiters. You might be taken to culinary paradise after just one bite, or you might be rushing to the closest public fountain to wash your fingers. There was no middle ground. In a sense, the Romans were ahead of us since they had globuli, but we moderns have churros, donuts, and fried Oreos. Dairy products deep-fried in sugar weren't invented. A revival took place. All you needed to do was endure the stickiness. You now yearn for something a little more sophisticated, dignified, less dripping, and possibly even elegant. Dates filled with nuts are the Roman equivalent of a gourmet dessert. These small bundles were surprisingly simple, and Apicius called them dulcia domestica in his recipes. Remove the pits and stuff them full with finely chopped almonds or walnuts. Then sprinkle with honey, roll them in it, or drown them completely, depending on your social standing and lack of taste. Take some fresh dates, sticky, brown, mushy, and already halfway to jam. They appear innocuous at first, like a rustic little treat that you would be proud to give to your grandmother. But watch out, they were dense, heavily packed, heavily flavored, and potentially damaging to teeth if exposed to excessive sun exposure. Imagine edible stonework in the form of nature's confection. Although the wealthy undoubtedly showed them off at feasts, they weren't reserved for nobility. Dried dates were also occasionally obtained by slaves and members of the working class, particularly at festivals when gluttony was momentarily promoted and the negative effects on digestion were tactfully disregarded. The texture was enthusiastic, to put it mildly. The honey served as old Roman superglue, the nut brought a crunchy surprise, and the date offered chewy resistance. Eating one frequently requires seclusion and dedication. They adhered to your toga, your teeth, your hands, and if you took the last one, sometimes your interpersonal relationships. Surprisingly good in terms of nutrition, nuts provided a protein boost, dates were heavy in sugar and energy, and honey, well, honey just made everything seem more upscale. The Romans said it helped with digestion, but let's face it, they were just happy to get something sweet without bones. These snacks were the ideal last-minute apology, gift, or contribution, because they also traveled nicely. They served as throwable objects with just enough weight to convey your point, were carried into combat by soldiers, and were handed by lovers like tasty love notes when times became tough. This was one of the most popular sweets in the empire that ruled over the known world. Satisfying, sticky, and possibly harmful. If there is one Roman snack that still causes controversy today, it is this one. So let's take a quick detour into the slightly insane stuffed dormice. Indeed, little fuzzily-eyed rodents have a regrettable propensity to wind up on the dinner plates of the aristocracy in ancient Rome. Consider it the initial conflict between amazement and To be fair, not everyone was consuming exalted pet hamsters out here. This was mostly an issue for the wealthy. Ordinary people continued to eat lentils and boiled onions, but if you were a member of the Roman upper class, the kind that wore togas, quoted poetry, and owned villas, you fed guests dormice. Not because of need, but because, well, prestige. In tiny ceramic pots known as gliraria, basically a mouse-sized gym without an escape, the dormice were fattened. Before stuffing them with nuts, herbs, and minced pork, they were supposed to be nice and plump. They were then roasted, honey-dipped, or both. Because you can run past multiple cooking lines instead of just crossing one. They would be gently picked up by guests who would act as though they were unaware that the tail was still attached. It was said that the flavor was nutty, but you can sure it's just a way for folks to sound sophisticated. In all likelihood, it tasted like greasy mouse and poor choices. Furthermore, they weren't even against the law. Dormice farming was actually subject to regulations. That was the extent of this practice. As though to convey the message, here lies Gaius. The Romans wrote about it, made jokes about it, and even etched them onto ornate mosaics. He had mice and money. Here's the worst part, though. Like the Roman foie gras, they were regarded as delicacy, despite their strangeness, extravagant, contentious, and somewhat morally dubious. What made them eat them then, since they were able to? Because they wished to make an impression. Because running the Mediterranean didn't really encourage dietary restraint. It sounds terrible to us. It was fancy finger food to them. Furthermore, a crispy, honey-glazed dormouse was essentially tame, in a culture where eating flamingo tongues wasn't even the most bizarre aspect of the meal. It goes without saying that you deserve something reassuring, something gilded, something that doesn't stare back. Now for the honey cake, or libum, as the Romans called it. To be clear, these were not the soft, fluffy sponge cakes of today. There were no slices of them being Instagrammed. Roman honey cakes resembled a sweet brick rather than a dessert, since they were heavy and dense. They also come in a variety of forms and chewiness levels, from delightfully squishy to dagger hard. The traditional recipe for libum, a thick dough made of cheese, flour, and egg, was formed into a neat, small loaf and baked on a leaf. Because are you even Roman if you're not baking on foliage? They were covered in honey after baking, not dripping, not glazed, wet. The kind of soak that, when there's only one slice left, destroys friendships and tunics. In Rome, honey was considered liquid gold. It served as a skin treatment, sweetener, preservative, and evidently the solution to the question of what to put on this dubious cake. It resulted in a sticky, cheesy, slightly sour-sweet confection that stuck to your fingers and your reputation in society. Sometimes your breakfast pastry was also a spiritual sacrifice, as they were provided at religious festivals, family get-togethers, and sacrifices to the domestic gods. There is no pressure. Additionally, there were layers of class baked in, just like in any other Roman meal. Families with lower incomes may substitute barley or rye, omit the cheese, and add a dash of diluted honey. On a technical level solely, a cake. Of course, the wealthy added enough honey to drown a centurion, along with almonds and spices. Here's the worst part, though. They were adored, the sort of stuff that individuals recalled from their early years, hoarded like bees in togas and fought over at banquets. They weren't ostentatious. They lacked beauty. However, they were sticky, delicious, and may lead to property conflicts. Picture waking up in classical Rome. There is already a lot of noise on the streets. Your head is aching from yesterday night's 1 cup of diluted wine that turned into 4, and your neighbor is yelling about past due amphorae. You're late, sleepy, and broke. You reach for breakfast, of course. Eggs, however, not fruit, not even a decent dinner. No, you're choosing the traditional Roman way of beginning the day. Wine-soaked stale bread. It was a thing indeed. The Romans termed it sopium vinum, which translates to bread in wine and sounds like a magic. Since fresh bread was either too costly or inexplicably absent, you basically took old, hardened bread, tore it into pieces, and then soaked it in whatever wine-like liquid was available. It wasn't opulent, it wasn't attractive. Without the milk, sugar, and delight, it was Roman cereal. However, it completed the task. The rock-hard bread became digestible due to the wine's little softening. White or red was irrelevant. It was going in if it contained fermented grapes and was somewhat liquid. People occasionally added honey or spices, but only on exceptional occasions or when attempting to impress someone who had already witnessed you eating dormice. It was an efficient and necessary breakfast. Before a day in the fields, farmers ate it. Before moving bricks in the sun, laborers ate it. While feigning not to cry in public, philosophers ate it. This was Rome's lukewarm wine-flavored counterpart of coffee, if coffee is what ignites modern civilization. Naturally, the affluent ridiculed it while covertly enjoying their own renditions with honeyed bread, aged wine, and the arrogant demeanor of someone feigning to slum it for the occasion. However, this was the true beginning of the day for the typical Roman. This is where the twist lies. It wasn't always breakfast either. During meals, speeches, and casual forum eavesdropping, some folks simply dipped bread in wine all the time. It was a choice of food, drink, and way of life. Was it nourishing? Seldom. Was it honorable? Not particularly. However, it was inexpensive, soft, and drenched in alcohol, qualities that were considered a victory in ancient Rome. Sausage, the ancient human answer to the age-old dilemma, what do we do with the leftover bits? In ancient Rome, where preparing sausages was more about pushing the limits of what could be legally called food than it was about following recipes, this meat wrangling was welcomed with greater fervor than anywhere else. The version in Roman. Lucanica is a sausage that was named after the region of Lucania, but by the time it was sold in Rome, geography was not a major concern. What mattered to them was that it was suspiciously chewy, hot, greasy, and salty. Components? That's where the fun begins, though. With its hog trimmings, liver, lungs, heart, and perhaps more things best left unrecorded, Lucanica was frequently a pleasant mystery. To conceal the existential terror inside, it was put inside an intestinal shell, then grilled, fried, or smoked after being seasoned with pepper, cumin, fennel seeds, and a little bravado. Romans also adored them. They were publicly cooked on little braziers by street merchants, filling the already tumultuous city air with clouds of meaty perfume. In order to get their hot, greasy fix, people would wait in line, toga askew, pennies in hand. They were consumed by athletes as fuel. After eating them, philosophers began to doubt their own morality. Youngsters pleaded for them and quickly felt remorse. The quality of the sausages varied greatly, of course. They may be gently flavored and finely ground for imperial feasts. The street ones? To put it simply, you were happier the less you asked. Rumors circulated about organs you've never seen on a butcher's chart, possibly dog parts and donkey parts. Storage was hopeful too. Meat smoking was more art than science, and there was no refrigeration. Accordingly, some sausages matured like excellent wine, while others did things you would report to the police. Nevertheless, they were carried into battle, eaten in arenas and sold at Thermopolia. Sore feet and a dried sausage in his pouch were two things a Roman soldier going across Gaul could be sure of. It was flavorful, high in calories, and strong enough to be used as a self-defense tool if needed. Now let's discuss Roman pancakes, or, as they may have put it, flat disappointment dripping with hope. Alita doltia seems good in theory. It means another sweet, and was basically a simple pancake made with milk, eggs, and spelt wheat. Honey got involved sometimes, not always, and just that contradiction reveals just how much of an emotional roller coaster this meal was. Pour the batter into a skillet over a fire that might or might not be cooperating, stir it, and then wait for the magic to happen. However, maple syrup and fluffy stacks were not part of Roman magic. These pancakes were dense, thin, and just sufficiently solid to be considered edible flooring. If you were lucky, they would be served with a considerable amount of honey, and if someone felt festive, a sprinkle of poppy seeds. They would also be cooked in a little oil. If you were unlucky, you were given the version that had the texture of a legal document and no sweetness or toppings. Nevertheless, they were widely used, inexpensive, simple to produce, and surprisingly adaptable. They may be offered during festivals, funerals, and that awkward place between breakfast and guilt. They could be savory or sweet, eaten hot or cold. A breakfast revolution was not what the Romans were searching for. All they wanted were calories that didn't hurt. But be sure to lower your expectations right away if you're picturing a contemporary pancake with strawberries and whipped cream. These cakes were more fuel than meal, more endurance snack than decadent brunch, and they required strong teeth and low emotional standards. They did, however, have a place. They made people feel full. They went well with wine. They gave you the fleeting impression that you were in charge of your life, which was somewhat consoling in a world full of intrusions, political intrigue, and mystery meat sausages. And occasionally, just occasionally, the honey would caramelize and the batter would crisp just right on the edges, making you think, this is almost good. The real legacy of the Roman pancake was that momentary delight which lowered the standard sufficiently to be delightfully surprised. Were they, therefore, uninteresting? Indeed, were they loved? Yes, in some way. Because even mediocrity, ideally accompanied by honey, had its place in Rome. Roman food has an honesty about it. There was no pretense of grandeur. The fat was left untrimmed. They also didn't waste time on delicate portions or neat fillets when it came to fish. No, they immediately went for the parts. Crunchy, fried, salty, and occasionally unrecognizable. Consider this. Perhaps you're just downwind from a fishmonger in the Subura, or you're exploring the Ostian docks. You smell something fishy, something searing, something that has most likely been out since dawn. A greasy tray of fried fish bits, lovingly covered in oil and what may be flour or street dust, appears as you follow your nose. Nobody is certain anymore. What specifically were you receiving? That is, everything small enough to throw whole into a pan, including fish heads, tails, and fins. One favorite was anchovies and sardines. The Romans occasionally ventured into the realm of mystery seafood, frying whatever critter happened to fall into the net that day. It was an easy cooking process. Toss the fish into some heated oil and hope it crisps before burning. season with salt. If you were in the mood for something aristocratic, perhaps a spritz of vinegar. If hygiene was not a concern, serve it directly into the customer's hand or wrapped in a fig leaf, which it generally was, let's face it. There were these tiny, crunchy marine critters everywhere. They were served by thermopolia. Market vendors yelled at them. Children purchased them as snacks. Everyone was aware that you don't need to ask what part of the fish it was if it was sufficiently cooked. Good in terms of nutrition, calcium, protein, and omega-3s. You were really crunching through the bones. Also, you had a Mediterranean aroma that lingered for days. Here's the magic, though. People adored it. Elegance was not what the Romans sought. They desired crunch, fat, and salt. And these chunks of fish did not disappoint, quite loudly, greasy. Yes, I'm full, it said to your stomach. And we don't talk about this, it said to your dignity. You've already consumed wine-soaked bread, mystery-filled sausage, and a pancake that is legally acceptable as building material. Perhaps you're in the mood for something healthy, a fruity stuff, something that says, "Today I made a wise choice." Here comes the Roman fig cake, or the ancient technique of making leftovers appear purposeful, as some contemporary historians prefer to refer to it. There were figs all over Rome. Romans had about 3 hours between ripe and fermented, and it was plentiful, inexpensive, and extremely perishable. What were they going to do with the extras? They crushed them into cakes of figs, small clumps of mashed fig, sometimes combined with flour or nuts, sometimes formed into discs and nearly always served as dessert. It had an ambitious texture, sticky, chewy, and a little scary if not stored properly. The flavour? The length of time the figs had been exposed to the sun determined that. In the best circumstance, it's naturally sweet and rich. The worst situation, one could charitably describe the tart flavour character as surprising. They occasionally added honey, which was beneficial. They didn't always, which didn't happen. Sesame seeds were added to some varieties, making them a snack that adhered to your teeth like emotional baggage. For ease of transportation and believable deniability, others were wrapped in leaves. However, fig cakes were well liked by people of all social strata, in spite of their modest origins. They were taken into the fields by farmers. While evaluating other philosophers, philosophers nibbled on them. Even the wealthy enjoyed them, but with a dash of smugness and spices. Like old-fashioned granola bars, they were frequently distributed to crowds during festivals. They also became the preferred offering for gods, house spirits, and that one neighbor you didn't like but had to be courteous to because they didn't spoil quickly. Let's not act like they were glitzy. To fig pastries, no one was penning love poems. However, they were nutrient-rich, dense, and incredibly versatile. The culinary version will suffice. And let's be honest, the modest fig cake provided a unique type of stability in a society where other desserts either stuck to your hands or attempted to get off your plate. It didn't glisten or dazzle, but it also didn't resist, and that's sufficient at times. You've consumed enough fried, fermented, and honey-drenched food at this stage of your Roman culinary adventure to make you reevaluate your life decisions. We haven't yet examined one of Rome's most treasured interests, but don't worry, cheese. In particular, cheese nibbles, the kind that might be enjoyable or regrettable right away. Cheese was more than just a food in ancient Rome. It was a way of thinking. They had aged cheese, hard cheese, soft cheese, and the type of cheese that, by today's standards, could be considered a biological weapon. Romans enjoyed munching on cheese in between meals, or more precisely, in between dubious choices. Fried cheese patties are a good place to start. These were created by mashing soft cheese, perhaps a curd that resembled ricotta, combining it with wheat or semolina, shaping it into little discs, and then deep frying them in oil until they turned golden. They were a popular dessert in Thermopylae and taverns. It sounds delicious, doesn't it? Yes, it was, but only when consumed hot. After allowing them to cool for 5 minutes, you found yourself chewing on something that felt like an old sandal. Some contained herbs and a strong, savoury flavour, while others were sweetened with honey. Sometimes someone would add dried fruits or nuts, which sounded creative in principle, but frequently tasted like trail mix that had been put into a grilled cheese by accident. Now you might come across aged Roman cheese if you were especially unlucky. This wasn't your polite cheddar or delicate French brie. No, it was strong, abrasive, and often regarded as fragrant. Ancient cook-speak meant, don't breathe in too deeply. Others were kept in baskets, exposed to the sun, and perhaps used to ward off unwanted visitors. Still others were aged until they were more salt than cheese. Cheese nibbles were supplied to soldiers, given out at festivals, and even given as gifts at Saturnalia, because nothing says thank you like a block of cheese that could also be used as a paperweight. They were inexpensive, satisfying, and if you didn't mind their retaliating, remarkably shelf-stable. Despite their contradictions, the Romans loved cheese snacks. They were portable, reassuring, and only sporadically dangerous. To put it succinctly, they were the ancient world's version of mozzarella sticks, only without the sticks or cheese. While some cultures have hot sauce, others have ketchup. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, was used in ancient Rome and somehow found its way onto, inside, or close to almost every edible item in the empire. To be clear, garum was not something you drizzled softly, nor was it delicate or graceful. It was fish juice that had been fermented by packing fish guts into clay pots, adding a lot of salt, and then letting the whole thing sit in the sun until it ceased to scream. The outcome? The Romans poured this brown, greasy, salty, and sour liquid over cereals, meats, vegetables, and yes, even snacks. Garum-dipped bread? Of course. Grum and roasted nuts? Why not? Garum mixed with fried cheese? That's Roman food for you, but you're living in peril. Not only for taste either. Garum was influential in society. Some were for the poor, while others were so exclusive that they were older than the typical gladiator. Throughout the empire, Licamen, Alec, and other varieties were marketed with claims to purity, provenance, and most likely, health advantages. Imagine it as the artisanal, organic soy sauce of ancient Rome, but with more intestines. It should be mentioned that because of how foul the stench of garum manufacture was, it was officially only allowed outside the city borders. Yes, garum industries were prohibited from the neighborhood, even in Rome, where sewage ran freely and public baths were at best experimental. But it was gold after it was bottled and shipped. Cooks swear by it, emperors hoarded it, and ravenous people spread it on almost anything immobile. It was the most commonly accepted olfactory crime in Rome, and its favorite flavor bomb. Did folks find it enjoyable? Apparently so. They included it in cookery and lauded it in poetry. Recipes that started with the phrase, "First, drown everything in garum," were the subject of their love letters. Was it wholesome? Maybe. Was it too much? Always. Did it give fried street delicacies a mystical touch? Yes, if you enjoy strong, fishy, and slightly questionable magic. Therefore, don't merely think of fig pastries or cheese balls when you think of Roman junk food. Imagine fig pastries and cheese balls covered in fermented fish sauce. Because in Rome, winning tasted like that. You still want to eat something informal, a crunchy item, something you can eat with one hand and wave wildly at senators as they pass by with the other. Let's talk about Roman street nuts. You may hear the distinct sound of nuts roasting over open embers whether you go through any busy Roman marketplace, the Forum, the Porta d'Ostia, or the back alleyways of Subura. Not in the warm, festive manner. It smells more like the combination of salted temptation and a burning street cart. Your decisions? Hazelnuts, pine nuts, walnuts, and almonds. Though dropping the last may cost you your dignity and potentially a substantial amount. The majority were roasted, seasoned just a bit, and occasionally flavored with honey or spices. Easy, addictive, affordable. They were sold by vendors in small paper cones constructed from pieces of papyrus or discarded wax tablets, sometimes still bearing handwritten grocery lists or poor poetry. Extra amusement. The Romans, too, they were ecstatic. Philosophers ate them and thought about death. For nourishment, gladiators devoured them. Intoxicated partygoers threw them, with differing degrees of accuracy, into mouths and occasionally amphorae. They were peeled, gilded, and probably brought to them on a silver tray by someone who was anxious, yet even the emperors nibbled on them. Even some were candied. The closest thing Rome had to peanut brittleness were almonds coated in honey, which, depending on how fresh they were, could either break your teeth or win your love. Naturally, there were drawbacks: indigestion, social repercussions, and theatrical readings of your last will and testament could result from overindulging in nuts, particularly those coated with garum. However, because street nuts were quick, inexpensive, and incredibly gratifying, nobody was deterred. The first Roman vending machines were these: put in a dime and get crunchy happiness. In a city driven by wine, ambition, and low-grade anarchy, there is only a handful of salty delight, no fuss, mystery meat, or stories. You've had senatorial parties. You may have kissed someone who turned out to be your cousin's slave, bathed in wine, and performed poorly at a Saturnalia feast. The after is it you're wearing your toga sideways. Your mouth tastes like dubious life decisions and garum. You require assistance. However, aspirin and black coffee are not helpful in Rome. Instead, you receive the hazy hope that Jupiter still loves you, along with a heroic, half-medicinal food. Now for the Roman version of hangover cuisine. The remedy-all wine-soaked bread comes first. Yes, once more. More wine, now absorbed into a stale loaf so dry it threatens to exfoliate your gums, is the best way to remedy a wine-induced catastrophe. Or perhaps you are served posca ovata, which is a raw egg swirled into spiced wine. Imagine it as the original protein shake without the joy, cleanliness, or refrigeration. When someone older than the Republic insists that it makes you laugh again, swallow your pride and try not to gag. Still feeling woozy? It's time for an Etruscan hell snack platter. Nothing soothes the sinuses like salty brine and remorse, so have some pickled fish, garlic, olives, and onions soaked in vinegar. Fried cabbage with oil and cumin is a well-known choice. Supposedly miraculous, practically greasy, strong, and prone to causing more issues than it fixes. Roman physicians vowed to uphold it. Most Roman diners cursed at it. Sweet options were dates marinated in wine and sprinkled with pepper, or figs with vinegar and honey. To be fair, these most likely did assist. They were hydrating, sugary, and just strange enough to take your mind off your headache. And you could always go full gladiator if nothing else worked. A punch to the chest to wake you up, a handful of barley and a raw onion, confidence and humiliation, no science. Romans didn't refer to it as a hangover, of course. To be honest, it sounds more realistic to refer to it as being tormented in the head. They believed in their remedies, even though they weren't always successful, with the same zeal that they thought fried dormice were elegant. So there you are, crouched over a thermopolium counter, munching cabbage and drinking spicy vinegar while you beseech Bacchus for forgiveness. Roman-style welcome to recuperation. Before he was the bane of Rome, and before elephants roared across the Alps, Hannibal Barca was a little lad with a sharp mind and big eyes who had already been shaped by the crucible of vengeance. It is approximately 237 BCE. Who is the guy who is most hurt by the fact that Carthage, the once proud North African nation, just lost the First Punic War to Rome. The boy's father, Hamilcar Barca, not all he was a general, fierce, intelligent, and deeply humiliated by Rome's triumph. He embodied the Carthaginian spirit of tenacity. He wasn't finished fighting either. Therefore, Hamilcar took his 9-year-old son with him when he was ready to go for Iberia, or what is now Spain, in order to restore Carthage's power and establish a new empire. However, this was not a journey to bond. This was brainwashing. According to mythology, Hamilcar took Hannibal to the temple of Baal before they left, where he was instructed to place his small hand on a gory altar of sacrifice. He forced his kid to take a sacred pledge there, promising never to tolerate, ignore, or be friends with Rome. Consider that. Math, swordplay, and a lifetime grudge are not common school subjects taught to children. Hannibal, however, was not brought up like other children. His father was his general, retaliation was his curriculum, and his classroom was a war camp. Hannibal watched and learnt as they marched into Iberia. He seen his father forge tenuous alliances, win vicious battles, and annex land 1 mile at a time. Hannibal observed every Roman ambassador that sniffed around. He recalled every failed discussion and every Carthaginian soldier who had bled on foreign land. The youngster was already toughened by the time Hamilcar went away, and Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, took over. Years after Hasdrubal's murder, the army elected Hannibal, who was now 26 years old, to assume leadership. Not the soldiers, not the Senate, not the elders, not the people who had watched him mature, fight, and take charge. The oath of a child becomes a man's mission in that same moment. Despite Rome's victory in the first round, Hannibal Barca was going to alter their entire perspective on terror and battle. Hannibal warmed the commander's seat without hesitation. He launched a campaign so vicious and successful that it would have made Rome tremble from across the ocean as soon as he seized control of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia. He started with the Hispanic tribes, who were divided, arrogant, and often at each other's throats. Hannibal courted some of them through bribery, marriage connections, and diplomacy, rather than advancing like a conqueror. He utilized steel for the remainder. Psychological warfare combined with tactical skill was used to crush recalcitrant tribes. Hannibal arranged battles in addition to fighting them. Once the enemy believed they were winning, he would flank and encircle them after letting one portion of his army pretend to retreat. The soldiers adored him because he was as adept at playing mines as he was at using swords. Hannibal fought in the midst of the fighting, marched with them, and shared their food. He wasn't a spoiled general observing from a golden carriage. With them, he bled. In large, overpowering quantities, he evoked fear, just as he evoked loyalty. Rome started to feel the strain as Carthage's influence in Iberia increased. Carthage would not cross the Ebro River, according to a treaty they had struck with Hasdrubal prior to his passing. Hannibal, however, had no interest in Roman documents. He had a much more ambitious plan. He thus targeted Saguntum, a Roman ally located immediately south of the Ebro. Not only was attacking it audacious, but it was almost a declaration of war. Rome anxiously observed, uncertain whether Carthage would hold back this aspirational young general. As a spoiler, they didn't. Saguntum was effectively and brutally besieged. After starving them and attacking their fortifications, Hannibal eventually took control of the city. The survivors were either sold into slavery or slaughtered. Rome had a response. Hannibal wasn't scared, and he wasn't bluffing either. Naturally, the Roman Senate was indignant. They requested that Hannibal be turned over by Carthage for breaking the treaty. How did Carthage react? A shrug from everyone. The lords quarreled and the Senate argued, but nobody had the courage or possibly the will to restrain him. Now that he had conquered Iberia and Rome was raging across the water, Hannibal, who had become larger than Carthage, turned his attention to Italy. By accomplishing the impossible not by ship, not by a courteous declaration of war. He would use elephants to carry the conflict right to Rome's doorstep. His officers believed Hannibal had gone insane when he declared his intention to attack Italy by land across the Alps, not by sea or treaty. The Alps were more than simply mountains. They were deadly traps, dangerous, shrouded in snow, and teeming with savage tribes. With thousands of men, pack animals, and a few African war elephants, no rational commander would try it. But sane was not Hannibal's goal. Shock and amazement was his goal. He started the most audacious military operation in antiquity in 218 BCE. Hannibal marched north from Iberia with an army of about 50,000 men and 37 elephants, passing through the Pyrenees, engaging in combat with Celtic tribes, and finally arriving at the Rhone River. He transported his elephants there using rafts and native guides. Elephants on rafts, indeed. Just the logistics were crazy. Rome was taken by surprise. They anticipated that he would arrive by water, or in the worst-case scenario, via the typical coastal routes. But before he had even made it to the Alps, Hannibal was changing the rules. Everything that might go wrong happened when they finally started the Alpine ascent. Equipment was buried by landslides. The troops were blinded by snow. Thousands perished from famine, frigid winds, and altitude sickness. The supply was exhausted. Morale fell. Men started to leave. Elephants fell into ravines after slipping on the ice walkways. According to reports, one soldier had to use a pickaxe to chip frozen horse hooves away from cold rock. However, Hannibal continued to move. Pointing to the far-off Italian plains, he inspired his warriors with the promise of abundant farmland, loot, and retribution against Rome. He dragged his army over the most deadly obstacles in nature by using fire to break ice, vinegar to erode rock, and sheer willpower. Hannibal came out on the other side after 2 terrifying weeks, barely alive and with less than half his previous power. Into the valley of Po, weary, beaten, and frostbitten. However, in Italy, Rome too, they were appalled. They never thought an enemy would show up at their door like this. Elephants were not supposed to be used to traverse the Alps. Hannibal, however, had done it. It was more than a march. There was a message. Rome is not secure. Not at all, I'm present. Furthermore, he had no immediate plans to go. Once on Italian soil, Hannibal wasted no time. He promptly started enlisting Rome's opponents, the disgruntled Gallic tribes in northern Italy, despite having a smaller army. And they joined him because Hannibal didn't simply promise emancipation, he demonstrated it with blood. Stunned but yet haughty, Rome hurried to deploy soldiers to stop him. Confident in the Republic's confidence, Consul Gaius Flaminius assumed leadership. He desired an immediate triumph, a spectacular one that would re-establish Roman honor following Hannibal's absurd Alpine escapade. But Hannibal had already selected his battlefield, and it wasn't going to be spectacular for anyone in a red cloak. It was Lake Trasimene, a misty, slender valley with steep hills on one side and water on the other, ideal for an ambush. Hannibal stationed his infantry in front, fully visible, like bait. Then, in the early morning mist, he hid his elite infantry and cavalry in the hills. Flaminius rushed in on June 21, 217 BCE, enthusiastic, overconfident, and utterly unaware of what was about to happen. Hannibal snapped his jaws tight as the Romans moved into the trap. His army blasted into the Roman flanks from the hills. Cavalry stopped the retreat. The Roman line, spread thin in the small pass, had nowhere to move. There was mayhem. Roman soldiers were killed where they stood, trampled underfoot while attempting to escape, or drowned in the lake. Flaminius was killed while attempting to reorganize his disintegrating army. Within hours, 15,000 Romans had been killed, and thousands more had been taken prisoner. Hannibal, too. Not a single cop was lost. The biggest and most effective ambush in military history was the one at Lake Trasimene. Rome was in a frenzy, with prayers and shouts filling the streets. Mothers cried. Desperate, the Senate chose Quintus Fabius Maximus, a dictator, to handle the situation. Hannibal, however, was far from done. After invading their territory and decimating their legions, he now traversed Italy like a phantom, destroying everything in his path. But Rome refused to engage in negotiations even after this catastrophe. Hannibal was cool with that. Peace was not what he desired. In the center of their dominion, on the battlefield, where they believed they were unbeatable, he wished to degrade them. His most lethal work was yet to be completed. Cannae was Hannibal's symphony of destruction, if Lake Trasimene was his masterwork of ambush. By 216 BCE, Rome had stopped being cautious and had stopped using defensive tactics and waiting. Under the leadership of the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, they assembled the greatest force they had ever fielded, which numbered about 80,000 troops and was double Hannibal's army's strength. They had no intention of outwitting him. They intended to use extreme force to crush him. Hannibal grinned, knowing. He selected the battleground, a broad plain in southern Italy close to the town of Cannae that was ideal for cavalry movement and maneuver. He then formed his army in a formation that was surprisingly straightforward. In the middle, his weakest infantry, mostly Gauls and Spaniards, formed a shallow crescent. On the flanks, his more powerful African infantry awaited. His actual hammer, his cavalry, flanked considerably more widely on both flanks. They laid the trap. Eager to strike directly through Hannibal's center, the Romans moved forward in a thick, strong column on the morning of combat. And they did. Hannibal's crescent initially retreated but did not shatter when it was compressed, bending inward. With the belief that triumph was imminent, the Roman army charged ahead, advancing farther and farther into the trap. The jaws slammed shut at that point. The Romans were surrounded on all sides by the wheeling inward movement of Hannibal's African army on the flanks. After defeating the Roman horsemen, his cavalry turned around and launched an attack from behind. The Romans were now totally encircled. Blood and chaos, no escape, no breathing room. Men suffocated amid the crush of bodies in the scorching August heat. They were unable to swing swords, panic-struck, and Hannibal's forces methodically killed them in one of the most lopsided massacres in military history. More Romans perished in a single day, between 50,000 and 70,000 according to some estimates, than lived in several ancient cities. It is still regarded as one of the deadliest conflicts in history and was the worst defeat Rome had ever experienced. And Hannibal, he didn't march on Rome. He knew Rome would not fall quickly, not because he couldn't. He needs siege equipment, time, and troops from Carthage. Carthage, however, paused. Hannibal stood alone even after delivering Rome her darkest day. And Rome, scarred, vindictive, and now terrified, had no intention of allowing him to escape punishment. A Roman rabble could be quieted by Hannibal's name alone after Cannae. It was employed by mothers to scare their kids. Portus belonged to Hannibal. At the gates stands Hannibal. Ironically, though, he never set foot in the city. Hannibal roamed the Italian countryside like a phantom for 16 years, unbeaten, erratic, and totally unsupported. He earned the loyalty of numerous southern Italian cities and brought confusion to Rome's allies. However, despite its wealth, Carthage declined to provide him with the assistance he required to complete the task. The Senate was afraid of his increasing influence. His ambition was a secret among his domestic adversaries. Instead of arming him for a last blow, they felt more at ease letting him slowly bleed Rome. Hannibal had to adjust as a result. He mastered the art of survival by engaging in guerrilla warfare, disrupting supply routes, destroying crops, and constantly evading capture. Under Fabius Maximus, sometimes known as the Delayer, the Romans declined to engage in combat. They followed him around, avoiding confrontation and depriving him of chances. Hannibal, however, continued to win. He defeated entire consular armies that dared to pursue him, ambushed Roman forces in Apulia, and decimated Roman forces at Herdonia. And he kept doing it without ever losing a key engagement. However, time was not on his side. Rome, bruised but unyielding, adjusted. They bolstered their relationships, trained new leaders, and constructed additional legions. Rome grew its dominance like a hydra, gaining additional heads, while Hannibal roamed around with a dwindling army. And the conflict started to change. Rome cut off the Carthaginian supply lines by invading Iberia. Like Hannibal years earlier, Hasdrubal, Hannibal's own brother, attempted to traverse the Alps to provide reinforcements. He was stopped by Rome, who then destroyed his army and tossed Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp. It was an obvious message. Now you're by yourself. Hannibal was losing interest in his plan to destroy Rome from inside. Italy has become a cemetery of legions because of him. However, he was unable to strike the decisive blow in the absence of siege engines, reinforcements, and political support. He would not go, however. When he was a youngster, he had vowed to his father that he would not be friends with Rome, and he maintained that pledge every year he remained on their soil. Rome would knock soon, though, on the shores of Carthage itself, not in Italy. Hannibal would be forced to return home for the last battle. The tide had completely changed by 203 BCE. Rome had recovered from catastrophe, overrun Hannibal's Iberian strongholds, and advanced straight to North Africa to continue the battle. Scipio Africanus led the charge. He was a young, bright general who had studied Hannibal's strategies in great detail. Rome has had enough of waiting. They desired the destruction of Carthage, and the Carthaginian Senate had to undertake the unimaginable in order to rescue itself. Hannibal was called home. Hannibal departed from the territory he had bled for after 16 years of almost legendary campaigning in Italy. He went back to Carthage to fight a warrior skilled in Hannibalic combat and to protect a city that had deserted him. The last battle took place in 202 BCE at Zama. This time the armies were almost equal. Hannibal led an army of 80 war elephants, levies, and veterans. Meanwhile, under the vital leadership of Massinissa, a former Carthaginian ally who had defected, Scipio had tamed Roman troops and Numidian cavalry. Hannibal launched a huge elephant charge to start the fight. It was supposed to fracture the Roman lines. Scipio, however, had anticipated this. He gave the command for his soldiers to divide, forming passageways that allowed the elephants to pass through securely. The animals either fled in terror or moved innocuously among the Roman soldiers. Some even retreated, stepping on Hannibal's own defenses. An intense infantry battle ensued. The veterans of Hannibal fought bravely, even driving back the front lines of Rome. However, as Hannibal had done at Cannae, the Carthaginian line fell apart as Scipio's cavalry came back from the flanks and launched an attack from behind. The roles had been switched. The maestro of encirclement, Hannibal, was now its victim. Carthage was compelled to give up. The language was harsh. They had to pledge never to go to war without Rome's consent, give up their fleet, and pay a hefty indemnity. Hannibal was defeated, but it wasn't only a military defeat, it was a vision's demise. In the dust of North Africa, his life's work to unsnap Rome's hold on the Mediterranean was crushed. Rome did not, however, murder him despite their defeat. They were too afraid of him to declare him a martyr. Knowing full well that they hadn't seen the last of him, they chose to let him live. Because history wasn't finished with Hannibal Barca. Not quite yet. Hannibal was a survivor, not a vanquished general, when he returned to Carthage. Even though Zama had militarily destroyed Carthage, Hannibal was still highly respected. The public viewed him as the man who almost won the war against insurmountable odds, rather than as the one who lost it. Well, what was Hannibal up to? He changed who he was. He entered politics. Indeed, the man who had once led elephants across the Alps was now seated in the Carthaginian Senate, attempting to mend the broken state, purging corruption, and revamping the financial system. He swiftly established himself as a clever, if unpopular, reformer by cutting taxes, paying off debts, and reviving Carthage's economy. Rome, however, wasn't observing from a distance. Hannibal's thinking was more terrifying to them than his blade. If Hannibal was in charge, a powerful Carthage, even one that was peaceful, was dangerous. Rome, therefore, falsely accused him of plotting with adversary nations. Hannibal was cornered again and ran away. This was the start of his second life as a hunted exile. He moved from court to court, pitching foreign kings his military prowess. First to Rome's newest adversary, Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. Hannibal attempted to mobilize them for yet another major conflict, but Antiochus mostly disregarded his counsel and suffered a crushing defeat. Rome's power only increased. Hannibal continued to run after Antiochus was defeated. Roman envoys followed him relentlessly as he drifted through Asia Minor, demanding his surrender at every port. He turned into a ghost. Nevertheless, he left behind rumors, myths, and terror wherever he went. Romans were still shivering at the mention of Hannibal. He remained a one-man uprising against imperial hubris and a symbol of defiance despite his failures. He was unable to muster more armies. He had only a sharp mind, a long shadow, and enemies who were always following him. He had neither a homeland nor any power. He was now in his 60s, grey-haired, and exhausted from years of exile and conflict. Rome wasn't content either, because Hannibal was still more shrewd than the majority of generals alive. They wanted him removed from the narrative as well as from politics and the battlefield. In keeping with his nature, Hannibal refused to give them the satisfaction when they came for him one last time. Hannibal was a living legend by the early 180s BCE and a danger to all kingdoms that dared to host him, not just Rome. He was now in hiding in Bithynia, a minor state in Asia Minor governed by monarch Prusius the Fay. Hannibal, ever the strategist, used a tactic straight from his playbook to assist the monarch win a naval battle. To wreak havoc and terror, clay jars with poisonous snakes were launched onto enemy ships using catapults. His intelligence was always 2 steps ahead, even in his last years. But snake jars meant nothing to Rome. They desired Hannibal's permanent removal. They threatened Prusia's, dispatched emissaries, and applied pressure. Hannibal eventually learned of the betrayal of his sanctuary. The villa where he was hiding was being targeted by Roman agents. This time, he did not run. Legend has it that Hannibal carried a vial of poison concealed in a ring with him for a long time, as insurance. He would leave on his own terms if Rome ever cornered him like an animal. The time had now arrived. Before ingesting the poison, he apparently scrawled a brief statement. The Romans believe that waiting for an elderly man to pass away is too tiresome. Therefore, let's alleviate their long-standing dread. It was over in an instant. Rome's worst nightmare, Hannibal Barca, perished in a faraway country while being persecuted, banished, and left alone rather than on a battlefield. Nevertheless, Rome was unable to bury him even after his death. Decades later, during the Third Punic War, they demolished Carthage, salted its soil, and destroyed his city. However, they never forgot him. Roman historians, who ought to have detested him, spoke about his genius with wonder centuries later. He had outwitted every Roman commander sent to murder him, led from the front, and battled against overwhelming odds. He caused years of devastation in Italy, led elephants across the Alps, and instilled a fear that would never go away in the greatest military machine in history. He accomplished all of this while upholding his youthful vow to never be friends with Rome. Hannibal prevailed in a different sort of conflict, the war for legacy, even in exile and death. And he hasn't lost that war yet. In ancient Greece, the area between Athens and the tiny town of Eleusis would undergo an odd metamorphosis every autumn. Smoke and incense floated through the hills, along roads crowded with chanting pilgrims. And something holy and forbidden happened there in the shadows, in the light of the candle, and in secrecy. The most well-known and enigmatic religious celebration in antiquity was the Eleusinian Mysteries. It was a spiritual initiation as much as a celebration, and this one had rules unlike the public splendor of Olympic festivities or the boisterous Dionysian orgies. Strict regulations. You risk being put to death if you break the hush and discuss what transpired within the place of worship. The festival's central figures were the harvest goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone. The underworld god Hades is said to have abducted Persephone. Devastated, Demeter made the crops of the world wither in grief. Finally, an agreement was reached. Persephone would be above Earth for a portion of the year and below for another. The agricultural cycle was powerfully symbolized by this tale. Decomposition and regeneration, death and rebirth. However, the puzzles were cosmic rather than merely agrarian. For the Greeks, this was about the soul's destiny rather than merely farming. Maestai, the participants traveled for several days. They carried holy items, bathed in the sea, and fasted. They then proceeded to Eleusis and entered the Telesterion, a large chamber used for the most sacred ceremonies. It's still up for discussion what they saw or experienced inside. Some believe that Persephone's return was symbolically reenacted. Others think it was a visionary experience, possibly facilitated by kykeon, a hallucinogenic potion. People were altered by it, whatever it was. Many of the greatest thinkers of antiquity, from philosophers like Plato to emperors like Hadrian, studied the Eleusinian mysteries and came away with the conviction that life continued after death. This was religion as transformation, not as obedience, a sacred experience of life's cycles of loss and rebirth. And the mysteries of Eleusia persisted for more than a millennium, longer than most civilizations. The old gods were banned, and the mysteries of Eleusis were buried forever until the rise of Christianity. The pledge of quiet never was broken. Thus, the enigma endures. Ancient Egypt sought something much more spectacular, public religion on display, whereas Greece shrouded its sacred rituals in secrecy. And the Opet festival was the festival that best exemplified this. One of the most spectacular religious celebrations in ancient Egypt was the Opet festival, which took place every year in the splendid city of Thebes. Why? To restore the pharaoh's divine nature and strengthen his holy connection to the gods, particularly Amun-Ra, Thebes' principal deity. It started in the enormous temple of Karnak, which was the residence of the Theban triad, the powerful deity Amun, his wife Mut, and their son Khonsu. On ceremonial boats known as barks, priests carried their holy idols that were enclosed inside golden shrines. These were not your typical boats. They were huge, gilded, and frequently transported through the streets on the shoulders of scores of monks. They were thereafter carried down the actual Nile. Where are they going? About 2 kilometers away, the Luxor temple is connected to Karnak by a stately avenue dotted with hundreds of sphinxes. There was no solemnity or silence in the trip between the temples. It was colorful, dramatic, and full of spectacle. The streets were crowded with chanting priests, acrobats, musicians, and dancers. The general public turned out in large numbers, not only to observe, but also to take part. Many Egyptians saw this as their opportunity to witness the divine being displayed in the city in a brilliant, open, and proud manner rather than concealed behind the inner sanctums of a temple. Furthermore, this was not merely a showy ritual. Frequently participating in religious reenactments, the pharaoh himself joined the procession. In some ancient times, it was thought that during the event, the deity Amun spiritually united with the pharaoh, renewing his divine mandate to govern. It was a resurgence of power via divine sanction rather than conquest. Additionally, there was a very human component. The rigid distinctions between priests and mortals were relaxed during the festival. They danced, drank, and feasted. It was a moment of heaven briefly touching earth, a moment of delight wrapped in holiness. Depending on the time period and the pharaoh's financial constraints, the Opet festival could have lasted anywhere from 11 to 27 days, and even though every celebration was unique, the message was always the same. The gods were happy, Egypt was in harmony, and Ma'at's divine order persisted. That meant everything to the Egyptians. If the Opet festival was about royal divinity and the Eleusinian mysteries were about divine secrets, then Saturnalia was a week-long celebration during which Rome happily flouted its regulations. Saturnalia, a deeply ingrained celebration of the end of the harvest and a yearning for the fabled golden age when Saturn ruled and all men were free and equal, was held annually in December in honor of Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture, time, and emancipation. Romans attempted to relive the dream for a few tumultuous days. A public feast was held after a sacrifice at the temple of Saturn in the Forum. Social conventions were then completely upended. Slaves were serviced by their masters. Instead of wearing togas, senators donned vibrant tunics. Gambling, which is typically prohibited, was freely allowed. Work ceased, schools were closed, the courts closed. At least not in the conventional sense, Rome did not operate. The election of a Saturnalian king, commonly known as the Lord of Misrule, was one of the more unusual customs associated with the celebration. This was frequently a slave, a low-ranking citizen, or even a little child who was granted fictitious power to give ridiculous orders. In the streets, sing while nude. Hold a plate balanced on your head. Part of the enjoyment was complying with these absurd directives. During Saturnalia, individuals also traded poems, little figurines, wax candles, and gifts. It had a warmth that seems strangely familiar. It was humorous, and it was light-hearted. Indeed, many academics contend that one of Christmas's cultural forebears is Saturnalia. The dining, the candles, the gift-giving, and the timing all reverberate throughout time. Saturnalia, however, was more than a festivity. It was a valve for pressure. It made it possible for the fleeting illusion that everyone was equal in a society that was so rigorously organized, with senators at the top and slaves at the bottom, that perhaps, just possibly, Saturn's legendary golden age would return. Naturally, after the festival was over, everything fell back into place. Slaves went back to work. The Senate went back to arguing. The streets became silent. Rome, however, was transformed into a theater of happiness, mayhem, and humanity during that week of reversal. For an empire, too, needs a vacation from acting like it has everything under control. The ancient Persians were already celebrating a festival of fire, balance, and regeneration long before alarm clocks and New Year's countdowns, one that endures to this day. The Persian New Year is called Nowruz. Nowruz, which has its roots in Zoroastrianism, one of the earliest monotheistic religions in the world, was more than just a day on the calendar. The spring equinox, when day and night are completely balanced, was observed on that day. For Zoroastrians, this equilibrium symbolized the never-ending conflict between Angra Mainyu, the power of disorder and darkness, and Ahura Mazda, the force of light and order. Nowruz represented the triumph of optimism over despair, of cleanliness over corruption, and of light over darkness. Weeks in advance, preparation got underway. Debts were paid off, walls were cleaned, and homes were vacuumed. This went beyond simple spring cleaning. It was a cleanse of the soul. Anything untidy or filthy has to go. There were fires along the city walls and in courtyards. People would jump over fires on New Year's Eve and yell, "Give me your red color, take away my sickness." According to Zoroastrian belief, the fire was more than just heat and light. It was cleansing. Then followed the haft-seen table, a set of 7 symbolic objects that started with the Persian letter S and resembled an altar. Greens blossomed for expansion, sabzeh; garlic for protection, seer; dried fruit for love, senjed; vinegar for wisdom, sirke, and more. Every object stood for a cosmological or moral ideal. During this time, unique rites were held in temples known as fire temples. In addition to offering aromatic woods to the ever-burning sacred flame, Zoroastrian priests dressed in white robes recited hymns from their sacred writings, the Avesta. For believers, it was an opportunity to take stock, realign with Asher and truth, and welcome the cosmic wheel's rotation. However, Nowruz was not only solemn, it was also festive. Families congregated, tables were laden with food, kids were given presents, and musicians played flutes and drums in the streets. This was a time when everything was reset, not just the year, but the soul as well, for a civilization that valued cosmic order. Empires were outlived by Nowruz. The Achaemenids, Parthians, and Sassanids all celebrated it, and it is still observed today in Iran, Central Asia, and other places. Few religious celebrations from antiquity have lasted this long, but then again, few are so gracefully centered around something as timeless and universal as the return of light to the globe. Incense and stillness were not the only aspects of worship in ancient Athens. In other cases, it meant booze, masks, and a party-loving god. The deity of wine, fertility, theatre, and sacred insanity is Dionysus. And the great Dionysia was the festival that best reflected his frenzied genius. This festival, which took place every spring, wasn't just a fringe cult event. In the Athenian calendar, it was one of the most significant public occasions. Instead of using solemn chanting or animal sacrifice, it used theatre to glorify Dionysus. Comedy and tragedy were played in his honor. A procession across the city marked the start of it. As they took a statue of Dionysus to the theatre of Dionysus at the base of the Acropolis, citizens sung hymns, waved staffs draped in ivy, and carried enormous phallic symbols. Yes, really, a tidal surge of wine-fueled enthusiasm was present, along with flutes and dancers. The performances followed. Playwrights presented 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play apiece as part of a religious competition that lasted for several days. These performances weren't informal. Up to 15,000 spectators witnessed these state-sponsored competitions, which were judged by a select group of residents. It was civic obligation to attend. Even inmates could be allowed to attend on bond. Themes: gods, destiny, arrogance, retaliation, conflict, and agony. Euripides, Sophocles, and Aeschylus. The tales these geniuses narrated tore the soul apart. Imagine your neighbors gasping in shock as you see Oedipus learn he married his mother. It was more than just amusement. Ritual catharsis was what it was. The comedies followed the tragedies. Aristophanes used them to ridicule politicians, cast doubt on war, and parody society in general. They were raunchy, political, and frequently ridiculous. Nothing was forbidden. However, Dionysia was more than just theatre at its core. It was about putting on real masks to explore truths we couldn't otherwise speak out loud, about stepping outside of yourself, and about dismantling the masks society pushes us to wear. It was meaning-infused lunacy. Dionysus was not a serene, well-organized deity. He was untamed and wild, serving as a link between society and its earliest origins. That aspect of mankind was allowed to breathe, yell, laugh and cry in the Dionysia. This was not an escape for the Athenians. It was a religious thing, a wine cup in hand, the god of ecstatic transformation looking from the wings, and a mirror held up to the soul. Purim, a Jewish holiday that is half political satire, half survival narrative, and all about divine irony, is one of the most boisterous, theatrical, and subversively spiritual of all the ancient religious feasts. The events of the Book of Esther, which takes place in the Persian Empire under King Ahasuerus, likely Xerxes I, are commemorated on Purim. The storyline almost sounds like a scene from the epic Dionysia. Esther, a Jewish girl, ascends to the throne, conceals her identity, and ultimately puts herself in danger to foil Haman, the king's advisor, in his plan to exterminate the Jewish people. She is successful. The Jews are spared when Haman is executed on his own gallows. It is a tale about the strength of courage, the secret mechanisms of providence, and the reversal of fate. Purim, however, is an unadulterated celebration of delight, in contrast to somber religious holidays, a celebration of surviving that veers toward liberty and humor. The public reading of the Megillah, or Book of Esther, which is frequently done in the style of a comedy play, kicks off the festival. The crowd smothers any mention of Haman's name with shouting, booing, noisemakers, and graggers. Youngsters pretend to be Haman, Mordecai, or Esther. Chaos and costumes are welcome. Next to the commands to celebrate, feast on sumptuous meals, give food to friends, help the destitute, and, most famously, drink until you lose the ability to tell the difference between glorious Mordecai and cursed Haman. Yes, the Talmud does say that, but there's something deeper going on behind the celebration. In contrast to other Jewish festivals, the Book of Esther contains no mentions of God by name. That distinction is unique to this book in the Hebrew Bible. This lack compels readers to seek out covert divine intervention, a spiritual education devoid of overt disclosure. Purim teaches that through bravery, danger, and improbable heroes, miracles can happen behind palace doors, even when they don't appear to be fire from heaven or separated seas. Thus, satire, storytelling, masks, and parody are used to celebrate. In the face of death, they chuckle. They endorse something profoundly spiritual by making fun of the antagonist. Joy is resistance, and survival is holy. Early August was a hallowed and intensely communal time in ancient Ireland's misty hills and wooded valleys. The Celtic celebration of Lugnasad, also known as Lunasar, honors Lugh, the god of combat, light, and craftsmanship. In contrast to the elaborate temple celebrations of Egypt or Rome, Lugnasad was observed in fields by holy wells on hilltops and outdoors. The imperial spectacle was not the point. It was about the harvest, the land, and the precarious agreement between nature and man. The festival's namesake, Lugh, was a solar deity, a brilliant warrior, and an expert in all forms of art. However, Lugnasad was more than just open worship. Myth has it that Lugh celebrated the first festival in memory of Tiltu, his foster mother, who passed away from weariness after preparing Ireland's plains for farming. People came together in her honor to express gratitude for the first grain harvest and to make sure the soil would continue to produce. How did they rejoice then? Offerings were made to the land, gods and spirits after the first sheaf of grain was ceremoniously cut. This was not merely a symbolic act. Winter would be harsh if there was no harvest, were a type of spiritual insurance and were based on gratitude. However, Lugnasad had a social outburst as well. In what is sometimes called the Tailtean Games, a sort of mythical prelude to the Olympics, people travelled great distances to take part in fairs, markets, tournaments, and athletic events. Running, wrestling, horse racing, and even poetry and storytelling competitions were held. Trial marriages were also very common during this time. It was possible for couples to pledge to a 1-year-and-a-day union. They could physically walk away by standing back to back and going in separate directions if it didn't work out. Presumably, prenuptial agreements were acceptable to the gods. On holy slopes there were bonfires, feasts, and dancing, but there was always a humble understanding beneath the celebration. Nature provides and receives. In addition to being a time to celebrate the first fruits, Lugnasad was also a time to start getting ready for the days that were ahead. In a world with seasons, this event signaled the change from light to darkness. Winter was already keeping an eye on the wheat. As winter melts into spring, villages, towns, and cities all throughout the Indian subcontinent experience a riot of color, song, and fire. It's noisy, it's crazy, it is revered. One of the happiest and most significant holidays in Hinduism's long history is Holi. Holi has strong religious and mythical roots and is now well known for its clouds of colored powder and water wars. Fundamentally, it commemorates the triumph of good over evil, the coming of spring, and the destruction of the old to create space for the new. Holika Dahan, the ceremonial bonfire, kicks off the event the night before the color. The story of Prahlada, a devoted devotee of Vishnu, and his demon father Hiranyakashipu, who insisted on being worshipped in his place, is where it all began. His father plotted to have Prahlada killed by placing him on his sister Holika's lap, who was impervious to fire after Prahlada refused. However, divine justice had different ideas. Prahlada came out unscathed, while Holika burnt. Throughout India, Holika's effigy is burned in bonfires each year. The elimination of ego, hatred, and evil, as well as the purification of the soul by heat and light, are symbolized by fire. The color follows. The streets become a live kaleidoscope the following morning. People dance to drums and flutes, saturate friends with colored water, and hurl colorful gulal powders at one another. It's impossible to remain sober or clean. This anarchy, however, is ritual chaos. Social boundaries break down. Under layers of red, green, blue, and yellow, men and women, rich and poor, and young and old, all become equals. Strangers become friends, and enemies make amends. The world becomes unrecognizable for a single day, and in a lovely way. Holi is also associated with the story of Krishna and Radha, in which Krishna, feeling self-conscious about his dark complexion, smudged Radha's pale face with color. Their divine romance turned into a timeless allegory for divine union and playful love. Holi is therefore about flirtation, joy, and affection, rather than only fire and purification. A spiritual lesson about the seasons, the soul's tenacity, and the beauty of accepting impermanence lies behind the festivities, because the lesson Holi was always attempting to impart is what is left over after the fires go out and the colors disappear from your skin. Joy is sacrosanct, light comes back, and rebirth is always imminent. Among the clamor of Roman armies and the oomph of imperial parades, there was a ceremony so restricted and secret that not even the most powerful men in Rome were permitted to participate. No emperors, no senators, no priests, just women. This was the good goddess Bonadea's celebration. The event, which took place every December in the residence of Rome's highest magistrate, was both enigmatic and sacred. It honored a goddess connected to the ground, fertility, healing, and virginity. However, her precise beginnings and roles are still unknown, and that is intentional. There was a feminine secrecy surrounding Bonadea. Only the most aristocratic Roman ladies attended the ceremonies, which were led by the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most revered priestesses, It was strictly banned for men to know the ceremonies, let alone participate in them. Indeed, the events of the ceremony were unknown to even male historians. Scandal is the source of what we know. The celebration erupted into public scandal in 62 BCE. Even though he was unable to attend, Julius Caesar, who was then Pontifex Maximus, was hosting the rituals in his home that year as required. However, Pompeia, his wife, was in charge of organizing the party for women only. The situation changed when Publius Claudius Pulcher, a careless aristocrat, entered the ceremony covertly as a lady in an apparent attempt to woo Pompeia. They caught him. A trial ensued, transforming a sacred private ceremony into a public event. Caesar famously declared that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, and he divorced Pompeia notwithstanding Claudius's acquittal, which was probably the result of bribery. Beyond controversy, however, the Bonadea celebration unveils something unique. A hallowed area completely governed by women, where their issues of health, family, fertility, and bodily rhythms were positioned at the core of religious life. It was a time when the divine feminine ruled covertly and Rome's inflexible patriarchal stepped aside. Myrtle wreaths, a representation of Venus and perhaps sexual love, were prohibited. They passed off wine as milk. Offerings, music, and incense were performed. These may have even been symbolic fertility rites, but they were never seen by any man. A man would never. And perhaps that's the idea. The most potent rituals were those that were not recorded in a world when everything was recorded, because the sacred must occasionally be kept hidden, shielded by quiet, and transmitted solely by whispered recollection. Alchemy originated in ancient Egyptian temples and tombs long before it became a medieval concern with converting lead into gold. However, in Egypt it was referred to as chemia, or the black art, which was a reference to the rich, dark soil of the Nile Valley, also known as Kemet, or the Black Region, rather than anything evil. Transformation was sacred to the Egyptians and went beyond simple physical change. It applied to the soul as well as to things. Practical chemistry was already mastered by the ancient Egyptians. They made metal alloys, glass, dyes, cosmetics, and fragrances. They utilized sophisticated embalming methods, preserving the body for all time with linen, salts, and resins. However, these were not merely medical practices. These were transformational rites carried out with heavenly purpose. The preparation of the body and soul for rebirth in the hereafter was a cosmic process that included every mummification and every pigment crushed into paint. Indeed, it was believed that death itself was an alchemical process. The soul of the dead had to be refined via trials in the underworld, much like metals could be cleansed in fire. This spiritual transformation was guided by the Book of the Dead, which was filled with spells and incantations. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of learning, writing, and holy knowledge, was a central character in Egyptian thought. Later, during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek and Egyptian civilizations merged, Thoth was associated with the Greek god Hermes, resulting in the mythological sage Hermes Trismegistus, also known as the thrice great Hermes. He would go on to write the renowned Hermetic texts, which were mystical writings that established alchemy as a science of spirituality. The divine unity and the relationship between the macrocosm and microcosm, as above, so below, were discussed in these works in addition to material processes. The alteration of materials represented the alteration of the soul in Egyptian alchemy. A metaphor for transforming a defective self into a refined being was the transformation of basic metals into gold. Thus, later alchemists in Greece and Europe were essentially extending an ancient Egyptian concept when they looked for the philosopher, stone, or endless life. The lab isn't where that real change starts. The heart is where it starts. Ancient Persia offered alchemy a moral spine and a cosmic framework based on the never-ending conflict between light and darkness, while Egypt gave it its ritual spirit. Long before the invention of medieval laboratories, in the center of the Persian Empire, Zarathustra's teachings influenced a worldview that saw alteration as both desirable and essential. The universe was divided into two opposing forces by his dualistic vision: Angra Mainyu, the spirit of chaos, and evil, and Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, and order. This was metaphysics, not merely myth, and it had a significant impact on alchemical thought. Fire was a living emblem of truth and heavenly illumination, and Zoroastrians worshipped it. Sacred fires were never permitted to go out in temples. Like the alchemist's furnace centuries later, fire cleansed, revealed, and changed. Persians also created sophisticated metallurgical methods. They were among the first to experiment with alloys, smelt iron, and refine copper, silver, and gold. Their artisans were regarded as initiates in a process of refining nature, not merely craftsmen. It was believed that turning ore into gleaming metal was a cosmic alignment process that transformed chaotic, unrefined substance into something clean and organized. Proto-alchemical concepts, lists of minerals, metals, plants, and their physiological effects can be found in even the oldest Persian medical literature. In addition to healing the body, their goal was to bring it into harmony with the universe's divine order. Persian alchemical concepts will later be preserved and developed by Islamic scholars. However, even before the advent of Islam, a potent motif began to emerge that would reverberate throughout alchemical cultures from Arabia to Europe. That everything is dynamic, and that the potential for perfection is present in all impurities. Alchemists would eventually use this similar concept to change lead into gold, or the soul from a base to a celestial form. Therefore, Persian philosophy provided a moral alchemy that purified purpose as well as ingredients. Fire did more than merely melt metals, it exposed what was concealed and burned away lies. Persian alchemists believed that the holy spark that could transform anything, including the person, was hidden someplace in that hidden core, between smoke and spirit. Ancient Greece attempted to explain everything with logic, geometry, and a dash of cosmic arrogance, if Egypt provided the sacred rites of alchemy and Persia with the moral code. Alchemy developed here rather than disappearing. Greek philosophers attempted to rationalize the pharmacological and spiritual traditions of earlier societies. However, they looked for philosophy rather than crucibles and powders. Empedocles' conception of the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, formed the foundation of Greek alchemical thinking. These weren't merely tangible materials, they were the building pieces of reality and the fundamental ideas of the cosmos. This perspective held that change was just the rearranging of these components. Water could turn into earth, fire into air, and everything was in a perpetual state of change. Plato and other later thinkers added levels of significance. According to his description, matter is made up of small, invisible substances and flawless geometric shapes. In this interpretation, alchemy evolved into a pursuit of harmony with the ideal world as well as chemical interactions. Aristotle then arrived and changed everything. He suggested that there are four fundamental properties of all matter: hot, cold, wet, and dry. You could alter the drug itself by altering these characteristics. Gold was bright and balanced, while lead was heavy and dry. Therefore, lead might theoretically turn into gold if its qualities were changed to make it more noble. Does that sound familiar? The foundation of all subsequent alchemy was the concept of transmutation, or transforming one substance into another. The Greeks, however, did not merely rely on theory. Alchemy as a discipline eventually started to take shape in Hellenistic Alexandria, a mingling pot of Greek philosophy, Egyptian mysticism, and Babylonian astronomy. Early dye, perfume, and metal alloy formulae were documented here by academics and mystics, although they were always encapsulated in symbolic language. The legendary Hermes Trismegistus, who is credited with creating the Hermetic corpus, was born here. He was a hybrid of Greek Hermes and Egyptian Thoth. The purification of the soul as well as matter was discussed in these works, which exhorted practitioners to pursue inner reform in order to achieve divine connection. Alchemy wasn't about making money, according to the Greeks. It was about replicating the universe, comprehending nature, and using the hidden laws of reality to perfect oneself. And that made it something that was dangerously close to divine power rather than merely science. Alchemy discovered its real laboratory, not just of materials but of ideas, in the busy port city of Alexandria. Greek logic, Egyptian ritual, Babylonian astrology, and Persian philosophy all converged in Alexandria, a city founded by Alexander the Great and governed by the Ptolemies. At its core was the vast Alexandrian library, a harbinger of antiquity where academics and scrolls came from all across the world. In this setting, alchemy not only survived but flourished. Alchemy evolved into something mystical and exploratory, spiritual and useful at this point. Greek natural philosophy blended with Egyptian temple rituals. Greek medicine and Egyptian metallurgy were studied in conjunction with Babylonian star charts. The outcome? Part ceremony, part science, a new form of knowledge. Mary the Jewess was one of the first and most enigmatic individuals in Alexandrian alchemy. She is recognized for creating several of the earliest alchemical devices, including the tribicos, a distillation apparatus, a vapor purification system, and the bain-marie, a double boiler that is still utilized in kitchens today. According to her research, alchemists were actually performing chemical experiments rather than only speculating. Another important character was the alchemist Zosimos of Panopolis, who lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE and left behind some of the first Greek texts on alchemy. Zosimos, however, did not consider alchemy to be merely physical. He described spiritual cleansing, visions, and dreams. He saw the transformation of lead into gold as a metaphor for the transformation of the tainted human spirit into something heavenly. He explained the alchemical vessel as a representation of the body, as well as a container for chemicals. The vapor, the rise of the divine essence, the fire, the deep suffering of the soul. His writings made it difficult to distinguish between matter and metaphor, chemistry and mysticism. Hermeticism, or the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, had another important influence on Alexandrian alchemists. They wrote, "As above, so below." Both the macrocosm and the microcosm are reflected. You touch the other after purifying the first. Alchemy was more than simply materials in Alexandria. It has to do with reality itself. It questioned if the soul could change with matter, and not only what things were made of, but also why they might change. Alchemy was only beginning its journey as a mirror of the universe and of ourselves. The Islamic world took over as the new defender of alchemical knowledge when the great library of Alexandria collapsed and Europe entered the early Middle Ages. During the Islamic Golden Age, which lasted from the 8th to the 13th centuries under the Abbasid Caliphate, towns such as Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba became hubs for philosophical and scientific research. The basic works of alchemy were among the many Greek, Persian, and Indian classics that were translated into Arabic at a breakneck speed. Here's the twist, though. Islamic academics changed old alchemy rather than merely preserving it. Here comes Geber, also known as Jabir ibn Hayyan in the West. He was a polymath who lived in Kufa in the 8th century. Although his legacy is shrouded in mystery, he is frequently referred to as the founder of chemistry. The hundreds of Jabir's books combined Persian mysticism, Greek elements theory, and Quranic cosmology into a systematic science. He established a methodical approach to testing. Not literally, but as principles, he thought that sulfur and mercury were the building blocks of all metals, with sulfur standing for combustion and change, and mercury for volatility and fluidity. Jabir said that one metal could be changed into another if these two forces could be balanced. He also introduced processes including distillation, crystallization, sublimation, filtration, and calcination that are still used today. His devices served as the model for laboratories throughout the Middle Ages. Islamic alchemy, however, preserved the spiritual core of prior traditions and was not merely mechanical. Alchemy was viewed as a means of gaining insight into the divine. In accordance with God's order in the creation, transforming substance served as a metaphor for soul purification. The legitimacy of alchemy was contested by later alchemists such as Al-Razi, Razi, and Avicenna ibn Sina. Al-Razi endorsed it, highlighting its usefulness in medicine. Avicenna, on the other hand, accepted the intellectual and ethical goals of the profession, but disapproved of the concept of transmutation. They advanced alchemy beyond a craft of secrecy, even when they disagreed. It evolved into a combination of proto-chemistry, metaphysics, spirituality, and moral philosophy. Later, these Arabic writings would be rediscovered by European scholars who would translate them into Latin and bring alchemy back to the West. Nonetheless, Muslim thinkers retained, defined, and organized the core of that alchemy, the conviction that matter and spirit mirrored one another. Under their leadership, alchemy transitioned from myth to science. There was a stunning resurgence of this period under the shadowy stone towers of medieval monasteries and colleges in the 12th century, when the translated writings of Arabic alchemists such as Jabir ibn Hayyan al-Razi and Avicenna flooded into Europe. Latin scholars were able to access a wealth of lost knowledge when translation schools emerged in places like Toledo and Sicily after Europe had been in intellectual sleep. These included the alchemical texts, which were full of odd symbols, enigmatic substances, and transformational promises. The Europeans were captivated. Alchemy was more than gold to them. It provided power, wisdom, and perhaps immortality. The elusive philosopher's stone was transformed into the Holy Grail, which is believed to grant perpetual life and turn base metals into gold. However, it was more than just a tangible item. It represented the unity of spirit and matter. This dual nature was taken seriously by medieval alchemists. Friars and experimental scientists included individuals such as Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus. They held that alchemy was a means of deciphering the sacred script that God had written in the natural world, which contained the secrets of creation. Alchemy wasn't magic to them. It was a Christian natural philosophy that used the change of elements to explain the divine order. Monastic cloisters of fire and glass, crucibles, retorts, alembics, and furnaces containing lead, sulfur, mercury, and antimony were transformed into laboratories. Alchemy appeared to be impenetrable because experiments were documented in coded manuscripts that were rich with metaphor and allegory. But there was important work going on underneath the symbolism. Pseudo-Geber was a mysterious Latin author who transformed Arabic writings into European styles, making him one of the most significant characters of this era. Subsequent alchemists used his publications as standard references. Another important figure was Arnold of Villanova, who focused on developing elixirs that might restore and heal the body while obfuscating the distinction between alchemy and medicine. Medieval alchemy was not underground despite its secrecy. It was practiced by priests, supported by princes, and discussed at academic institutions. However, many continued to pursue the gold, sometimes physically and other times figuratively, in spite of its spiritual aspirations. Thus, the flame of change, which was a combination of faith, fire, and philosophical dream, continued to burn in medieval Europe. Alchemy persisted as Europe transitioned from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It changed. Strangely, it got more mystical, more symbolic, and more mysterious. The Rosicrucians, one of the most peculiar groups in alchemical history, sprang from this combination of Hermetic philosophy, Christian mysticism, and Renaissance humanism. Anonymous manifestos started to circulate throughout Europe in the 1600s. Christian Rosenkreutz's Chemical Wedding, Fama Fraternitatis, and Confessio Fraternitatis. According to these writings, a fictional character named Christian Rosenkreutz established the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, a covert fraternity, after traveling across the East and gaining knowledge of hidden wisdom. He then returned to Europe to discreetly mentor spiritual searchers. Here's the twist, though. There is no proof that the Rosicrucians were a real group, at least not initially. They were a symbol, an idea, and they had a significant impact. The goal of Rosicrucian alchemy was not to produce gold. The topic was enlightenment. It saw the cleansing of metals as a metaphor for the purification of the soul, fusing Christian esotericism with alchemical change. The Philosopher's Stone came to represent unity with the divine inner rebirth and Christ awareness. In their manifestos, they called for a covert spiritual revolution that would usher in a new era of prosperity for humanity, as well as a reformation of politics, religion, and science. However, they provided only symbols: the cross, sacrifice and change; the rose, secrecy and beauty, instead of names, addresses, or leaders. This was spiritual allegory through alchemy, full of veiled references and metaphor. The Rosicrucians held that truth was concealed because it required personal development, rather than because it was prohibited. Poets, artists, mystics, and scientists were all impacted by their theories. Rosicrucian texts belonged to Isaac Newton. Even though Johann Valentin Andrea, who is believed to have written The Chemical Wedding, considered the narrative as allegory, it quickly gained popularity among occultists. Alchemy was now laden with significance. Materials were still important to some. Others saw it as nothing more than a metaphor. The Rosicrucians saw it as a spiritual root that was concealed from view. Their effect was very real, whispering down the ages that the real gold is within, even though their fraternity may have been fictional. Alchemy started to coexist alongside something unexpected, modern science, as the 17th century progressed. It wasn't a clean break, though. It was difficult to distinguish between alchemists and chemists, and many of the people who developed the scientific method were, ironically, still searching for the Philosopher's Stone. Isaac Newton is among the most well-known instances. Indeed, the same scientist who developed the principles of gravity and motion studied alchemy more than physics throughout his lifetime. Newton secretly crammed notebooks with occult experiments, deciphering ancient symbols and trying to understand the universe's divine dynamics. He saw alchemy as a language inscribed in gold and fire to comprehend the universe, which he believed to be a heavenly machine. Newton was not alone himself. Alchemical philosophy also influenced Robert Boyle, who is frequently referred to as the founder of modern chemistry. His well-known work, The Skeptical Chemist, published in 1661, established the foundation for chemical analysis and questioned the traditional four-element hypothesis. However, Boyle also considered alchemy to be a legitimate topic of study and believed in the transmutation of metals. What then changed? The technique was the main distinction. Spiritual metaphor, secret, and symbolism had always surrounded alchemy. However, new scientists started to insist on evidence, reproducibility, and clarity. They began to abandon the esoteric terminology in favor of measurable outcomes. Once a realm of mystical mystery, the laboratory has evolved into a place of precise instruments and quantifiable reaction. Crucibles, alembics, furnaces, and other alchemical tools were the foundation of contemporary chemistry. The realistic quest to comprehend the constituents of matter supplanted the ideal of converting lead into gold. However, the alchemical perspective did not completely vanish. The ideas that systems contain underlying patterns that matter can change, and that with profound knowledge humans may influence the natural world. Silently, these alchemical concepts persisted. Instead of wearing robes, they just wore lab coats. Alchemy was mostly written off as pseudoscience by the 18th century. History, however, is not so neat. In actuality, alchemy served as the foundation for modern science. Furthermore, the alchemists accomplished more than only work with metals, despite their bizarre symbols and unrealistic fantasies. They posed the essential query: is it possible to alter the world? And science is still guided by that question today. Alchemy appeared to have disappeared by the 19th century, as logical thinkers rejected it as a charming remnant of pre-scientific mysticism. Its essence, however, never really vanished, like mercury in a flask. Rather, alchemy underwent a metamorphosis, reviving in contemporary spirituality, psychology, literature, and art. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung is the most unexpected descendant of alchemical philosophy. Alchemy, according to Jung, was not about actual transformation. It served as a metaphorical roadmap of the human mind. He became obsessed with studying alchemical texts because he saw a language of the unconscious in their enigmatic metaphors and images. Self-actualization became symbolized by the philosopher's stone. The psychological path toward individuation, the unification of all facets of the self, was reflected in the alchemical processes of calcination, dissolution, fermentation, and coagulation. Jung thought that alchemy, a coded spiritual practice masquerading as proto-chemistry, was the first form of therapy. Its true purpose was to heal the soul, not to produce gold. Alchemy continued to develop in this way. It endures in literature in works such as Faust, The Alchemist, and innumerable fantasy tales that emphasize secret knowledge, metamorphosis, and redemption. Alchemy is used as a metaphor for personal development in contemporary spirituality. The notion that hardship in life can lead to enlightenment and wholeness if it is refined. Echoes persist even in science. Given that components may actually be transformed, nuclear physics offers an intriguing mirror to alchemy's goal of comprehending and controlling the alteration of matter. Though not that it was feasible, the alchemists were mistaken about how it operates. Culturally, we continue to pursue alchemical objectives: the desire of endless youth, the quest for a panacea, the obsession with the transforming, the symbolic, and the hidden. Alchemy's enduring force comes from its inventiveness rather than its flawed formulas. Its faith in the world's malleability, the ability of the base to become noble, and the ability of knowledge to elevate both matter and soul when used appropriately. Alchemy survived. It just changed shape. It turned into chemistry. It turned into psychology. It developed into a narrative. It turned into a metaphor. And it became you, in a sense, because you're doing your own tiny alchemy each time you fight, develop, suffer, hone, and come out stronger. In soul, not in gold. And the true magic was always that.